Here he comes, Julia Sachs whispered. Everyone at our lunch table looked up. What amazing muscles, said Amber Sweeney. She was talking about our new gym teacher, Mr. Braun, who'd just entered the cafeteria. Because he was new that year, he'd gotten stuck with lunch duty. What a hunk, Julia said dreamily. What a freak, countered Josh Hopka. Mr. Braun was the most muscular person we'd ever seen in real life. His arms and chest bulged through his dark blue polo shirt, stretching the material tight. His neck was like a tree trunk and you could see the ripples in his stomach through his shirt. He's unnatural, I said. A freako, nature, Andy Kent summed it up. Josh and I smiled. We watched as Mr. Braun caught a glimpse of his reflection in a cafeteria window. He flexed his right arm, making the CLE bulge even more. I was certain his shirt sleeve was going to rip, but it didn't. Ah, my hero, Alex Silver whispered in a high falsetto. The guys chuckled, but Julia Sachs narrowed her big brown eyes at us. You're just jealous, she said. No way, Josh insisted. You think I'd want to be a musclehead? Forget it. He turned to me. What about you, Jake? Instead of answering, I glanced over at Amber, who was still gazing at Mr. Braun. Amber had long, straight, brown hair and smooth flawless skin. She was really pretty. See, Julia smiled knowingly. Jake wouldn't mind looking like that. Amber turned and caught me with her almond-shaped green eyes. I quickly looked away. Recent surveys show that big muscles are the #1 cause of stupidity, Andy announced. He was using the end of a plastic straw to pick some gunk out of his braces. That's a good one, Amber giggled. I'm serious, Andy insisted. The brain has to work so hard to control all those muscles that it doesn't have room to think. Everyone scowled at him. Andy was tall with short black hair. He often said weird things. We never knew whether he was serious or not. You know what they say, I added. Those who can, do. Those who can't, teach. And those who can't teach, teach gym. Amber laughed, revealing her straight white teeth. I felt good when I made her laugh. Watch this, Alex whispered to us. He waved his arm. Hey, Mr. Braun, what's up, Silver? The gym teacher stepped up to our table and crossed his massive arms. He had a deep, husky voice and a square face with short black hair. It was only 11:30 in the morning, but his jaw was already darkened by stubble. How long does it take to grow all those muscles? Alex asked innocently. Josh sniggered silently. Andy covered his mouth with his hand and tried not to laugh. Mr. Braun didn't notice. I started lifting when I was 14, he replied. Just about your age. How often? Alex asked. 4 or 5 days a week. Wow. Alex pretended to be impressed. How many hours a day? 2 or 3 at least. We traded amazed looks. It was hard to imagine doing anything for 2 or 3 hours a day. Except, maybe, watching TV. How come so much? Asked Alex. You have to work on all the major muscle groups, Mr. Braun explained. It's not just having big muscles. It's about symmetry and cuts. What's that? Andy asked. Symmetry means having a balanced physique, Mr. Braun explained. It looks bad if you have big pecs and no traps. Cuts mean muscle definition. You want to see each individual muscle. Oh, I get it. Alex gave an exaggerated nod. From the tone of his voice, we knew he was getting ready to deliver the zinger. But here's the thing I don't get, Mr. Braun. How come you can't find any clothes that fit? Julia Sachs looked away so Mr. Braun couldn't see her face. I bit down on my lip to keep from laughing out loud. Josh and Andy clamped their hands over their mouths and made funny, muffled noises as if they could hardly control themselves. Mr. Braun's face hardened and his eyes became beady. He'd just realized that Alex was goofing on him. This is the largest size this shirt comes in, Silver, he replied icily. He glared down at Alex and the red lunch tray in front of him. French fries, chocolate pudding, and lemonade. Is that your lunch ha? Alex grinned as if he were proud. Mr. Braun raised a disdainful eyebrow. That's what I call a real healthy diet, Silver. I couldn't help chuckling. Unfortunately, Mr. Braun saw me. What's so funny, Sherman? Nothing, Mr. I meant, Braun. It was an honest mistake, but everyone at the table stared at me. What is that thing on your tray? Mr. Braun asked. A potato, I said. This year the school had added a potato bar at lunch. What's on it? Melted cheese, pineapple, and bacon bits. Mr. Braun made a face like he wanted to hurl, then shook his head in disgust. You kids eat the worst garbage I've ever seen. I won't be surprised if your bodies fall apart by the time you're 50. That's coddle, Alex replied defiantly. Life's over by then anyway. You won't feel that way in 26 years, Mr. Braun said. After Mr. Braun left, Alex turned to us with a puzzled look on his face. In 26 years I'll be 40, not 50. He probably meant 36 years, Amber said. Yeah, I said, then you'd be 50. Alex shook his head in disbelief. Can't the guy ADDT, his brain doesn't have room to add, Andy said as he popped a couple of Skittles into his mouth. It's too busy telling all those muscles what to do. Give it a rest, Andy, Julia groaned. Hey, talk about no room for brains. Josh looked up from the table. Here comes Barry Dunn. A chill went down my spine. Coming toward us was a big kid wearing a baggy green t-shirt and black jeans with white patches on the knees. His head was shaved almost completely bald, except for one long blonde lock that grew from the back of his skull down between his shoulders. Earrings dangled from both ears. His deep-set eyes were focused directly on me. Better hide, Jake, Josh warned in a low voice. For some reason which no one understood, Barry Dunn hated me and picked on me constantly. If Amber hadn't been sitting at the table with us, I probably would have hidden. But I didn't want her to think I was chicken. As Barry came closer, the kids at the tables around us grew quiet. Everyone in school was afraid of Barry. They all watched as he came around our table and stood behind me. I braced myself for a major knuckle noogie, or a super painful shoulder tweak. Instead, Barry bent down and growled into my ear. Behind the garage in 10 minutes. But it's cold out, I whispered back. It was the first week of December. Barry dug his index finger and thumb into my shoulder muscle. 10 minutes, or die. Okay, I jerked my shoulder away. Barry turned and went out through the cafeteria doors. Everyone at our table stayed quiet for a moment. Josh pursed his lips. Amber looked away, as if trying to spare me any more embarrassment than necessary. Alex gave me a commiserating look. It's been nice knowing you, Jake. 4.5 minutes later I dropped my uneaten baked potato into the garbage. After that visit from Barry, I'd lost my appetite. Want us to come with you? Andy asked as we dumped our lunch trays. I shook my head. It'll just get him mad. If you're not back in 5 minutes, I'm telling Mr. Braun, Josh said. 5 minutes with Barry Dunn was an eternity. If he felt like it, he could do a lot of damage in that much time. I left my friends and went out through the cafeteria doors. Outside it was a cold, dreary day. The grass was covered by a thin film of frozen dew, and the sky was a solid blanket of gray. It felt like it was going to snow. Wearing only a long-sleeve shirt, I shivered and watched my breath turn to white vapor. The garage at the Burditch Middle School, we called it Burp It Up, was a low gray building on the other side of the bus circle. Dirtbags like Barry and his buddies went back there to smoke cigarettes and torture kids like me. Crossing the bus circle alone, I felt like I was walking down death row. Barry and a couple of his friends were waiting back there. One of his friends was wearing a black football jacket, the other a gray sweatshirt. Barry was wearing a t-shirt. His bare arms had turned red in the cold, but he had to show everyone how tough he was. The first thing he did was blow an air hanky, alternately holding one nostril closed while snorting out the other. I'd never seen him do that before. It must have been a newly acquired skill. He wiped his nose with his bare arm to clean up any nasal residue, then slid his right foot forward. The laces of his untied shoe hung down in the dirt. Tie it. I stared down at his shoe. Barry loved inflicting humiliation as much as he did pain. From deep inside I mustered just enough courage to say, tie it yourself. Barry squinted at me. I didn't hear you good. Well, that's not quite right, I said, desperately trying to stall. Actually, you didn't hear me correctly. Ha, Barry's forehead wrinkled. He wasn't the smartest kid in the world. In fact, some kids called him the dunce behind his back. I didn't hear you good is bad English, I explained. I don't care what language it is. Barry made a fist. Tie or die. The situation looked bad. If I didn't think of something fast I would have to choose between severe humiliation or a severe beating. You know what worries me? I asked. Now what? Barry snapped impatiently. Making me tie your shoes sort of implies that you never learned to tie them yourself. Barry frowned. Get off it. I turned to his dirtbag buddies. Every time you see him, his laces are untied, right? They nodded. Barry never tied his shoes. The laces were always flapping loosely on the ground. Barry turned to his friends, who were now giving him funny looks. Oh, come on, he sputtered. You know I can. His friends didn't look convinced. So Barry kneeled down and tied his own shoe. Then he looked up at us. See, knew you could do it. I gave Barry a wink and started back toward the cafeteria. I made it halfway across the bus circle before Barry and his friends caught up to me. Barry's face had turned red, but it looked like it was more from anger than the cold. You think you're smart, Sherman, he growled, making a fist. Now you're really gonna pay. If the situation had looked bad before, it really looked bleak now. Barry and his friends were blocking my path back to the cafeteria. I realized I'd made a major tactical error. By making Barry look dumb in front of his friends, I'd made him really mad. Mad enough to start a fight right there in the bus circle where everyone in the cafeteria could watch. But instead of throwing a punch, Barry slid his left shoe forward. Tie it. I looked down at the shoe. The situation had just gone from bleak to bleakest. This was 100 times worse than before. If I tied Barry's shoe now, the whole cafeteria would see. Tie or die, Barry glowered. My heart had started to pound, and I looked around quickly for a way out of this. If I refuse and you beat me up, everyone'll see, I said, trying to buy time. You'll get sent to the office. Principal Blanco will definitely suspend you. Good, Barry grumbled. I could use some time off from this crummy place. Now tie it. I felt a sick sensation in my stomach. By now everyone in the cafeteria was probably looking out the windows. Josh was probably taking bets on how much blood I was about to lose. Quit stalling. Barry made a fist and held it in front of my nose. Just then the cafeteria door swung open and Mr. Braun came out. Barry and his friends didn't see him because they had their backs to the cafeteria. In the following nanosecond I went from abject terror to total relief. You know, Barry, I said. I really think you should reconsider. Barry made a face as if he'd just sucked on something really sour. What? I'd really hate to have to kick your brains in, I said. Of course, that's provided I can find your brains. I know they can't be in your head. I guess I'd have to start with your toes and work my way up. Barry's eyes bulged out of his head. He gnashed his teeth and pulled back his fist to deliver a major bone-crushing punch to my face. Slap. A hand clamped on Barry's arm, stopping him from throwing the punch. Barry spun around and came face to face with Mr. Braun. Chill out, done. No fighting, the gym teacher warned. Barry quickly pointed at me. But he. Quote. His voice trailed off. He what? Mr. Braun crossed his massive arms and waited. Barry's eyes shot laser beams of fury at me. He couldn't tell Mr. Braun that I'd made fun of the size of his brain, and that was why he was about to massacre me. Move it, done. Mr. Braun pointed back toward the cafeteria, then nodded at Barry's friends. You, too. I see any of you lay a finger on Sherman, you'll be cleaning the shower room with a toothbrush. You're dead meat, Jake, Barry grumbled, and headed back to the cafeteria. My teeth had started to chatter in the cold, but I chose to wait until Barry and his friends went back into the cafeteria. Maybe I'd even wait until the next period before I went back inside. Barry Dunn was just enough of a head case to hang around inside the doors and pound me when I came in. What's the problem, Sherman? Mr. Braun asked. He was standing in the middle of the bus circle with his arms crossed. He didn't look cold at all. Maybe all those muscles worked like insulation. I shoved my hands in my pockets and shivered. I wasn't going to tell him anything. Let me give you a word of advice, Mr. Braun said. The only way to stop Barry Dunn is to stand up to him. That caught me by surprise. You mean, fight back? But we're not supposed to do that. Who says? Mr. Braun asked. Principal Blanco, the teachers, everyone. Principal Blanco can't tell kids to hit back. Mr. Braun said, there'd be 100 fights a day. But I'm telling you, nobody admires a wuss. And you'll never get a good girlfriend either. You think Bertha would have anything to do with me if I was a wuss? Bertha was Mr. Braun's girlfriend. He talked about her all the time. But we're supposed to find other ways to settle our differences, I said. That's what they've been teaching us since kindergarten. We're supposed to develop coping mechanisms and act mature, Mr. Braun shook his head. Don't give me that psychological mumbo-jumbo. It's time to start acting like a man, Sherman. Not a yellow-bellied wuss, I glared back at him. I was really tired of hearing him call me a wuss. Can I ask what you are doing, Jake? Andy said. He, Josh, and I were in my room after school, watching Total Recall, the movie where Arnold Schwarzenegger blows away about 100 bad guys a minute. We hung out in my room a lot after school because I had a 27-inch TV and VCR, lots of junk food and, best of all, my parents were never around. At that moment I was on my stomach under my bed. Braun said it was time for me to act like a man. Then why are you crawling around under your bed like a cockroach? Josh asked. To find this. I shoved a barbell and some weights out. Lance, my yellow Labrador retriever, came over and sniffed them curiously. Then he lay down at the end of the bed and went back to sleep. Across the room, Josh was sitting with his feet up on my desk. His arm disappeared into a family size bag of chips. A 2-liter bottle of Coke stood on the floor beside him. Josh had reddish hair, freckles, and a lot of extra beef around his waist. What are you gonna do with those? He pulled a large, perfect potato chip out of the bag and popped it into his mouth. He's gonna plant them in the backyard and see if they'll grow muscles, Andy cracked. I just want to try it. I slid a couple of weights on the bar, then reached down and hoisted it up to my chest. You're really gonna start lifting weights? Josh asked uneasily. Maybe. I grunted and pushed the bar over my head. Andy reached into the bag of chips, felt around for a good one, and pulled it out. You heard Mr. Braun today. It'll take you at least 15 years to get muscles like his. And that's lifting every day. You gotta start somewhere. Huffing and puffing, I lowered the bar back to my chest, then pressed it up again. I know why he's doing it, Josh teased. He wants to get a world-class girlfriend like Bertha. I thought he was in love with Amber, Andy said. Shut up, I grumbled. Or what? You're gonna beat me up with your brand new muscles. Andy grinned. FD take Bertha over Amber any day, Josh said. Why? Andy asked. No one's ever seen her. Braun just talks about her. He's got a picture of her in the gym office, Josh said. I saw it today. She's a real babe. And you know where she is right now. In Jake's closet. Andy guessed and then pretended to be a TV announcer. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the surprise you've all been waiting for. In Jake Sherman's closet, Ivy's Bertha the babe. She's at the Ms. Galaxy pageant, snotwad, Josh said. Never heard of it, Andy replied. Ever hear of the Miss America pageant? Josh asked. Or the Miss Universe pageant? It's a beauty contest, dimwit. In the movie, Arnold was mowing down bad guys left and right. I pressed the barbell again. If I was going to stand up to the dunce, and be a man, I would have to get a lot stronger first. Josh pulled another potato chip out of the bag. You trying to build strength or big muscles? Isn't it all the same? I grimaced as I pressed the bar up for a 4th time. Josh shook his head. You get strength by doing a lot of reps with medium weight. Big muscles you get by lifting really heavy weight just a few times. When did you become such an expert? Andy asked, grabbing the bag and pulling out a chip. Read it in Sports Illustrated, Josh answered. I put the bar down on the floor and added more weight to it. Whoa, looks like Jake's going for the big muscles, Andy said with a chuckle. I just want to try it. But before picking up the bar again, I stuck my hand in the bag, pulled out a bunch of broken chiplets, and stuffed them in my mouth. Josh yanked the bag away. Can't you ever take one chip at a time like a normal person? Bug off. I closed my hands around the bar and pulled up. With the extra weight it was super heavy. I managed to straighten up, but couldn't get the bar higher than my waist. You have to squat down really fast and yank it up under your chin, Josh said. You read that in Sports Illustrated, too? Andy asked. Saw it on TV, Josh said. It's called the clean and jerk. You're the clean and jerk, Andy quipped. And you're the dirt and jerk, Josh shot back. I squatted down and yanked. Crunk. The barbell slipped out of my grip and crashed to the floor. Oh woo. Lance jumped to his feet and let out a startled howl. Nice going, Jake. Josh grinned. I'd like to see you do better, Mr. Flabella. I picked up the bag of chips and pulled out another handful. Josh grabbed the bag away. One at a time. Then he swung his feet off the desk, squatted down behind the bar, and closed his hands around it. Ooh. He let out a long groan and managed to get the bar about 3 inches off the floor before letting it go with a thunk. Forget it. Breathing hard, Josh slumped back into the chair and took a swig of Coke. Now Andy got behind the bar and grabbed it. Hey, no fair. It's covered with potato chip grease. You can't get a grip. Good excuse. Josh smirked. Andy grabbed the bar anyway and managed to get it up to his waist, but couldn't get it any higher. He'd just put the bar down when the door opened and my sister Jessica stuck her head in. Jessica had thick brown hair, which she wore in a braid down her back. She was in 10th grade, a major brain pain, and a jock. This year she was seriously into soccer, basketball, and lacrosse. Where's the earthquake? She asked. Josh burped, Andy said. Get stuffed, Josh grumbled. UHO, the human trash compactor is peeved, Andy said. Josh shook his fist at him. I dropped the weights. I pointed at the barbell on the floor. Ah, wow, don't tell me the Couch Potato Club has decided to do something semi-athletic. Jessica squatted down behind the bar. I smiled at Josh and Andy. Josh winked back. A couple of days a week my sister worked out at the Burn Center, a health club in town, but there was no way she was going to get that bar off the floor. In a series of quick movements, Jessica yanked the bar to her waist, squatted and got it up to her chin, then pressed it until her arms were extended and the bar was high over her head. Then she quickly put the bar down. Piece of cake, but you should wipe off the potato chip grease. She dusted her hands and left. Andy and I shared a dismal look. Show off, Josh muttered. I reached for the bag and took a handful of chiplets. One at a time, Josh growled. Without another word, we sat down and watched Arnold slaughter a few hundred bad guys. The next day I walked down the hall at school with Amber. It was the last period and we were headed for the gym. So what do you call someone who lies near the front door all day? I asked. I don't know, she said. Matt, I said. Amber smiled. That always made me feel good. What about someone who hangs on the wall? I asked. Spider, she guessed. Art. The lines in Amber's forehead creased for a moment. Hangs on the wall. Oh, I get it. How about getting out of my way? Barry Dunn growled before I could finish the next joke. He was standing in the middle of the hall, blocking our path. Think you're smart, don't you? Barry snarled. I get by, I said. Try getting by, Thizzle. Barry stomped down as hard as he could on my foot with the heel of his shoe. A bolt of throbbing pain radiated up my leg and I had to grit my teeth to keep from crying out. Barry gave me a nasty grin. Next time it'll be worse. Then he marched away toward the gym. I had to limp the rest of the way down the hall. It felt like he'd crushed a couple of toes. Does it hurt? Amber asked. I gave her a look. Sorry, dumb question, she apologized. Barry's such a jerk. I wish there was something you could do about him. I winced. I'm sure Amber didn't mean to add insult to injury, but basically she was implying that I couldn't beat him up by myself, so I'd have to find some other way to deal with him. In other words, I was a wuss. We got to the gym, which was filled with dozens of plywood tables. What's going on? I asked. They're setting up for the science fair tomorrow, Amber said. Guess we'll be running relay races in the halls today. The girls' locker room was on the other side of the gym, so Amber headed in that direction. I limped into the boys' locker room. Just outside the locker room doors was the gym office. Through the window I could see Mr. Braun sitting at his desk, squeezing a red rubber ball in his hand. I knocked. The gym teacher looked up and saw me in the window. Doors open, Sherman. I went in. Mr. Braun kept squeezing the red ball. He noticed that I was watching. Hand strength, Sherman, he explained. When you're deadlifting 500 pounds, you need it. Till keep that in mind, Mr. Braun, I said. Meanwhile, can I be excused from gym today? Got a note? He asked. It just happened, I said. What just happened? Someone stomped on my foot. Just at that very second, Barry Dunn walked past the office window. I see, Mr. Braun said, gazing out the window. Sorry, Sherman. No note, no gloat. But I can hardly walk, I said. Don't worry, Mr. Braun said. I'll find something for you to do. What happened to you? Alex watched me limp down a row of gym lockers and sit on the bench near him. His locker was just a few feet from mine. Dunn crushed my foot. I whispered because Barry also had gym that period, and his locker was one row over. Alex's eyes darted around. He here yet? Yeah, I just saw him. Why? Instead of answering, Alex reached into his pocket and took out a short, fat metal spring. Stole this from tech shop. As soon as Dunn leaves his locker, put this in his lock. Alex got up and went around the corner. A moment later a voice that sounded just like Mr. Braun's bellowed, Dunn, in my office, now. Ah, man, now what? A row over, Barry groaned and headed for Mr. Braun's office. I quietly slipped into his row. He'd been in the middle of changing into his gym clothes, and had left his locker open. I dropped the spring in the lock, then hurried back to my locker. A few seconds later Barry returned. A moment after that, Alex sat down next to me on the bench. You do it, he whispered. Yeah, great. Take your time changing. We have to let the Dunns leave first. It wasn't long before we heard a locker slam shut and Barry passed again, this time wearing shorts, a t-shirt, and sneakers with untied laces. Come on, Alex whispered. We slipped around the corner and into the row with Barry's locker. The locker room was almost empty now. The spring had stopped Barry's lock from closing completely. Alex opened the locker and gazed in. Perfect. He grabbed Barry's shoes. We ran down to the toilet stalls. Inside one, Alex unlaced the shoes halfway, and slid the laces around the hinge that held the toilet seat to the toilet. Then he started tying knots. Tie lots of them. He gestured for me to do the other shoe. And make sure they're really tight. Where's my shoes? Barry growled at the end of the gym. Sitting in front of our lockers one aisle over, Alex and I winked at each other and changed out of our gym clothes. You had 3 choices when stuff disappeared from your gym locker. You could search through the dozens of empty lockers scattered around the locker room. You could look outside. Or you could look in the bathroom. Kids usually checked the bathroom first, since that was the easiest. Barry headed for the bathroom. A moment later we heard him scream, "Someone's gonna die for this." All around the locker room kids smiled. While it was true that Barry picked on me more than anyone else, he wasn't all that choosy. At one time or another, he'd hurt most of the guys in our class. So almost everyone was pleased to see him get it back. Alex and I finished changing. As we strolled out of the locker room, we casually glanced through the open stall door where Barry was bent over a toilet, grumbling furiously as he tried to undo all the knots in his shoelaces. Ahem. We were just about to leave the gym when someone cleared his throat behind us. Alex and I turned and saw Mr. Braun standing in the doorway of the gym office with his arms crossed. "Let's talk, boys." He gestured for Alex and me to enter his office. We gave each other an apprehensive look. "Busted," Alex mumbled under his breath. "Sneaking around like that isn't going to solve your problems." Mr. Braun was sitting behind his dark green metal desk. Alex and I were sitting in two old wooden chairs across from him. The desk was covered with papers, a phone, and a photograph of a really pretty blonde woman. I assumed she was Bertha, Mr. Braun's girlfriend. The photo only showed T at her face, but I could see why she was a contestant for the Ms. Galaxy pageant. Like Josh had said, she was really pretty. "All you're doing is making done matter," Mr. Braun went on. "And the madder he gets, the more he's going to pick on people. And since he doesn't know who tied his shoes to the toilet, he's going to pick on everyone." "How do you know who did it?" Alex asked. "A little birdie told me," Mr. Braun said. Alex and I shared a defeated look. There were a couple of teachers' pets in the class who could always be counted on to squeal. "So what are you gonna do to us?" Alex asked. "The question is, what are you going to do about Barry Dunn?" Mr. Braun replied. "Until one of you little runts stands up to him, he's going to keep picking on everyone." "Barry would kill us," Alex said. "Why don't you stand up to him?" "That's not my job, Silver, it's yours." "Well, most of the time we manage to fake him out," I said. "Maybe we don't have big muscles, but Barry's not too big in the brain department. It kind of balances out." "Or maybe you've just been lucky," Mr. Braun said. "Brains will get you just so far, Sherman. One of these days it's gonna come down to mano a mano. Your fists will have to do the talking. You'll have to act like a man." Buzz. Outside the bell rang. Alex sighed and shook his head hopelessly. The idea of trying to fight Barry Dunn was ridiculous. He was the biggest, strongest kid at Burp It Up Middle School. "Well, thanks for the advice, Mr. Braun," Alex said, a little sarcastically as he rose from his chair. "School's over. Can we go, or is this, like, detention?" Rap. Before Mr. Braun could answer, someone knocked on the gym office door. The door swung open and Mr. Dirksen, the science teacher, stuck his head in. "What can I do for you, Phil?" Mr. Braun asked. "I have to move something heavy into the gym for the science fair," Mr. Dirksen said, looking more at Alex and me than at Mr. Braun. "And I was hoping to find a few strong backs." Mr. Braun smiled at Alex. "Looks like the answer to your question is yes, Silver, this is detention. And while you're here, you can help Mr. Dirksen move his stuff. Go get your coats, boys. It's snowing outside." Alex and I got our coats and followed Mr. Dirksen out to the parking lot. It had started to snow really hard. The white stuff was coming down so fast that we couldn't even see the far end of the parking lot. "So, Jake, having a good year?" Mr. Dirksen asked as we trekked through the snow. "Not really," I said. "Why not?" he asked. "Barry Dunn's a major pain." Mr. Dirksen nodded. "He and I had accidentally switched bodies in 6th grade. After that I'd tried to behave better in school." Mr. Dirksen had gotten a toupee and tried to be less boring. He'd improved, but the old saying still applied, once at Weeb, always at Weeb. We stopped next to a yellow rented van and Mr. Dirksen opened the back doors. Inside was some familiar-looking science equipment. "It's the experiment," I said. "You finally got it to work." Mr. Dirksen's experiment was supposed to transfer intelligence from one creature to another, but it accidentally switched people's bodies instead. Not only had I gotten stuck in Mr. Dirksen's body, but Andy had once switched bodies with my dog, Lance. "I believe I have, Jake," said Mr. Dirksen. "At the science fair tomorrow, I hope to show that I can transfer trained behavior from one mouse to another." Alex had taken a computer monitor out of the van and was trudging through the snow back to the gym. I stepped closer to Mr. Dirksen. "So you fixed it so it won't make people switch bodies anymore?" I asked in a low voice. "Absolutely, Jake," Mr. Dirksen assured me. That will never happen again. It wasn't long before we carried all of the equipment into the gym and started to set it up. The experiment was so big that we had to push 2 plywood tables together. We were in the middle of assembling everything when Principal Blanco came in. He was a former gym teacher, a short, pudgy man with short curly black hair. He was wearing a green parka with a fur-lined hood. After-school activities are cancelled, he announced. The snow's knocking down power lines all over the place. Some of us have long trips home and we're not going to make it if we wait much longer. How are you boys going to get home? I'll call my mom, Alex said. We've got 4-wheel drive. Alex went out to the payphone in the hall. Principal Blanco turned to Mr. Dirksen. What about you, Phil? I guess I'll head home now, Mr. Dirksen said. Mr. Braun came out of the gym office. Why don't you go home, too? He said to Principal Blanco. I only live a few blocks away. I'll wait here until the boys get picked up. Thanks, Teddy, I appreciate it, Principal Blanco said. Make sure you lock up tight. I'd never heard anyone call Mr. Braun by his first name before. Teddy, talk about a wuss name. Pretty soon, the only people left in the gym were Alex, Mr. Braun, and me. Having nothing better to do, I kept assembling Mr. Dirksen's experiment. I'd assembled it with him once before and pretty much knew where everything went. It was kind of fun, like putting together a big model. Oh, man, Alex suddenly groaned. I didn't tell my mom which entrance to use. She's gonna go to the main entrance instead of the gym. Can you call her, Mr. Braun asked. Nah, she's probably left by now. Alex pulled on his coat. I'll have to go outside and flag her down. Alex went outside, leaving Mr. Braun and me alone in the gym. It was really quiet. This is some contraption, Mr. Braun said, looking over Mr. Dirksen's experiment. How do you know where everything goes? I told him how I'd helped Mr. Dirksen put it together once before. Mr. Braun wanted to know what it did and how it worked, so I explained it as best as I could. And explained it again and again, because he didn't catch on too quickly. Meanwhile, I plugged the heavy black electrical cables into the wall sockets. I wanted to make sure I'd connected everything correctly. Lights came on and the machine began to hum. Wow, said Mr. Braun. Phoom. Suddenly the lights went out and Mr. Dirksen's experiment stopped humming. The gym went totally black. It was a weird sensation. Almost like you didn't know which way was up. Sherman, Mr. Braun asked. It was so dark that I couldn't see him. I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face. Yeah, a power line must have come down, he said. Don't worry, the school put in a new emergency generator over the summer. It should kick in any second. Whoomp. The next thing I knew, an explosion knocked me off my feet. What happened? A voice asked in the dark. It sounded too young to be Mr. Braun's. Who said that? I was groggy and dizzy, and wondered if I'd been unconscious for a few moments. The air smelled funny, and my voice sounded strange. Much deeper than usual. Maybe my ears had been messed up by the explosion. I did, the voice said. Who are you? I asked. Mr. Braun, who else? Still in a daze, I pushed myself up to my feet. For some strange reason my clothes felt tight. I wished I could see, but everything was pitch black. Something must have gone wrong with the emergency generator, Mr. Braun said. You okay? I guess. But I wasn't okay. Something was definitely weird. Not only did the clothes I was wearing feel tight, but my hair felt different. I ran my hand over my jaw. Had stubble. Sherman. Mr. Braun's voice had a tinge of uncertainty, as if he'd just felt Ms. jaw. I think something strange is going on. In the dark I felt my arms. They were huge and bulging. My stomach was as hard as a washboard. My neck felt like a tree trunk. There was only one explanation. It had happened again. Meanwhile, Mr. Braun was talking to himself in the dark. These aren't my clothes. There has to be a light somewhere. I need a mirror. Something crazy's going on. What happened to my voice? Down at the other end of the gym, a door creaked open. Jake. Mr. Braun. Alex called into the dark. You guys okay? Yeah, I called back. Your mom here? Not yet, Mr. Braun, Alex replied, but all the lights went out. I heard an explosion. I came in to make sure everything was all right. Everything's fine, I said. Go wait for your mom. We'll be out in a second. The door creaked shut. The gym was still pitch black. What's going on, Sherman? Mr. Braun's, my voice quavered. You better call me Mr. Braun, I said. We'd switched bodies. The funny thing was, the more I thought about it, the more I liked it. What are you talking about? He asked. You're not me. I am. Not anymore. The door at the end of the gym creaked again. Guys, Alex called. She's here. Come on, we better go, I said. Go where, Mr. Braun? I asked in the dark. I'm not going with you. I'm going home. You're not old enough to drive, I said. Get off it, Sherman. I told you to call me Mr. Braun. Hey, you guys coming or what? Alex called from the other side of the gym. I don't know what this is about, Sherman, but I've had enough of this game. Unless you want to clean the bathroom with a toothbrush for the rest of the year, you better tell me what's going on. You wouldn't believe me. I started to feel my way around the plywood tables in the dark. Every time I bumped into one, it made a squeak as its legs scraped on the gym floor. Hey, where are you going? Mr. Braun, in my body, called behind me. Out of the gym. I'm not spending the night here. But I can't find my keys. I reached into Mr. Braun's pocket and pulled out a heavy ring of keys, then jingled them in the dark. They're right here. Give them to me. No way, Sherman. Don't call me Sherman, Mr. Braun snarled. Squeak. Ah, he must have banged into a table. Careful, Sherman, I said. That's my body you're banging around. Stop calling me Sherman, he shouted. I'm Braun, and when I get you, you're gonna be sorry. What's with you guys? Alex called from the other end of the gym. Sherman's just a little freaked, I said. I'm not, he shouted. Squeak. He banged into another table. Ah, take it easy, Sherman, I said. You're gonna pay for this. Squeak. Ah, hey, Jake, chill, Alex said. Don't call me, Foom. Suddenly the lights went back on. I had to squint in the brightness, but as my eyes adjusted, I looked down at myself. I was wearing Mr. Braun's sweatpants and dark blue polo shirt. I had his massive arms, legs, and hands. Several tables away, Mr. Braun was looking down at myself. He pulled my shirt away from my body. He stared at my hands, then squeezed my arms. With my fingers he felt my face. Then, with an expression of total disbelief and astonishment, he looked across the gym at me, himself. No, I don't believe it, he gasped. Don't believe what? Alex asked from the doorway. Sherman and I switched bodies. Mr. Braun cried. What? Alex looked at him like he was crazy. Sherman bumped his head, I said. I think he's a little confused. Mr. Braun's jaw dropped and his eyes widened. Why you? In my body, he charged between the tables at me. He tried to hit me, but I grabbed him by the shirt collar and held him back. He started hitting my arm, but it didn't hurt much. It was kind of depressing. I'd never realized what a weakling I was. Chill out, Jake, Alex warned. You can't hit Mr. Braun. You want to get suspended. He stopped swinging and glared at Alex. I'm telling you for the last time. I'm not Jake. I'm Ted Braun. Alex frowned and glanced quizzically at me. Head trauma, I said. Alex nodded gravely. Come on, Jake, my mom's waiting. We gotta go. I have to come with you, I said. The lines in Alex's forehead deepened. Why, Mr. Braun, my car doesn't have snow tires, I said. I'll never make it home. Well, okay, I guess we can drop you off at your place, Alex said. That was a problem. I didn't know where Mr. Braun lived, and I really didn't want to go there anyway. I better go home with Jake and make sure he's okay, I said. Alex gave me a puzzled look, then looked at Jake, who in turn was staring at me. You really want me to stay in your apartment tonight? I whispered to him. Jake, Mr. Braun, blinked as if he hadn't thought about that. I couldn't blame him. I'd been through this once before, but Mr. Braun had never been in someone else's body. Finally he shook his head. No. A little while later, Mrs. Silver turned her Jeep down Magnolia Street. It was dark and all we could see were millions of flakes in the car's headlights. On the radio we'd heard that the storm would probably continue through the night. Bet we'll have a snow day tomorrow, Alex said happily from the front seat. You want to shovel driveways. It was clear that he was addressing Jake, but Mr. Braun, in my body, was gazing out the window, not paying attention. I gave him a nudge with his elbow. Ha, he turned. Silver asked if you want to shovel driveways tomorrow. Jake frowned. It looked like he was going to say no. Maybe you'll want to talk in the morning, I suggested. Okay, Alex nodded. Mrs. Silver pulled up in front of my house. I reached for the door. Thanks for the ride, Mrs. Silver. You're welcome, Mr. Braun, Alex's mother replied. Jake, Mr. Braun, and I got out of the car and started up the walk. The drifts were deep and difficult to walk through. Blowing snow stung our faces. Wait a minute, Jake, Mr. Braun stopped behind me. What? I asked. I'm going back to school, he said. Now he really was acting crazy. Why, if that machine switched us, it can switch us back. Not without me it can't, I said. Mister. Braun stood in the snow wearing my clothes and staring at me with my eyes. Don't you want to switch back? I don't know, I said. What do you mean? He gasped. You can't just keep my body. Who says? I asked. I do, I smiled. Chill out, Sherman. I started through the snow toward the front door again, but a few steps later I stopped. Mr. Braun was standing in the middle of a drift with a stunned look on my face. You say anything to my parents or sister about this and you'll never get your body back, understand? I warned him. You saw what happened with Alex. No one'll believe you anyway. But it's true, he insisted. They'll have to believe me. Oh, sure. I grinned. Like people switch bodies every day. The funny thing was that my sister would have believed him because she'd seen it happen before. But Mr. Braun didn't know that. As far as he knew, it had never happened before. I pushed open the front door and stamped my feet on the inside mat. Mr. Braun, in my body, followed me in. That you, Jake? Jessica called from her room upstairs. I had to give Jake another nudge. Answer her, I whispered. Yeah, it's me, Mr. Braun, in my body, called up the stairs. I left some lasagna for you in the kitchen, Jessica yelled. Mom and Dad called from the city. They didn't think they could get home in this weather, so they're staying at a hotel tonight. Make sure you feed Lance and let him out. I gave Mr. Braun, in my body, a meaningful look. Sure, he called up the stairs. Mr. Braun's stomach was growling. You hungry? I asked. I guess. Well, I'm starved, I said. Come on. I headed for the kitchen and stepped over Lance's wooden gate. Lance was usually allowed everywhere in the house, but on the nights when my parents weren't around, we put the burglar alarm on and kept him in the kitchen so he wouldn't set it off accidentally. GMRRRMT. On the other side of the kitchen, Lance stood up and growled when he saw me. The hair on his back rose and his tail dropped. He bared his teeth and attacked. No, Lance, it's me, I shouted. Stop. Lance didn't seem to hear. At the last second I jumped back over the gate. Grroof. Lance skidded into the gate and barked angrily. Hey, come on. I kneeled down and got eye to eye with him. That's no way to treat an old friend, is it? Grrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr. I pressed my, Mr. Braun's hand against the gate. Lance sniffed it warily. You better let me come in, I said. Otherwise I can't give you dinner. Arf. At the word dinner, Lance started to smile and wagged his tail. I stood up, winked at Mr. Braun in my body, and stepped over the gate again. I gave Lance dinner, but when I opened the kitchen door to let him out into the backyard, he took one look at all that snow and backed away. Can't say I blame you, I said, closing the kitchen door. Lance went back to his dog bed and lay down. I went over to the kitchen counter where half of a microwaved lasagna dinner was covered with foil. That wasn't enough for me to eat, much less for me and Mr. Braun, Jake. That's when I noticed that he wasn't in the kitchen. Jake. I walked back to the gate. Jake, Mr. Braun, was standing on the other side. Want something to eat? I asked. Jake, Mr. Braun nodded. Then come on in. I gestured for him to step over the gate. Mr. Braun hesitated. Where is he? Who? The dog. Lance. In here. Why? Mr. Braun, in my body, didn't answer. He didn't come into the kitchen either. He won't hurt you, I said. How do you know? Because he didn't hurt me and he doesn't even know me, I said. He's known you all his life. But I don't know him, Mr. Braun said. Yes, you do, I said. You've known him since he was a puppy. Mr. Braun, in my body, scowled. I've never seen him before. I sighed. You've known him since he was a puppy because you're me, remember? Mr. Braun still didn't budge. Now what's the problem? I asked. Don't like dogs. How can you not like dogs? I asked. Well, I've just never. He didn't finish. Lance had gotten up to see who I was talking to. Mr. Braun, in my body, backed away. You mean, you're scared of him? I had to smile. Mr. Braun grit my teeth. I don't believe it. I laughed. The great and mighty Mr. Braun is scared of a doggle. What are you, a WUSST, Mr. Braun clenched my fists and bristled. I pointed a muscular finger at him. Hey, I'd watch it if I were you. Don't forget what happened before in the gym. Maybe you'd like to tell me what happened, someone said. I looked up, surprised. Jessica was standing at the other end of the hall. Who are you, anyway? She asked warily. You look familiar. I'm the new physical education teacher at the middle school, I said. Why do I feel like I know you? Jessica asked. I glanced nervously at Mr. Braun, in my body, but he shook his head as if he didn't know either. What are you doing here? My sister asked. Well, because of the snowstorm I didn't think I could make it all the way home, I said. Sherman, Jake, was nice enough to invite me to stay here tonight. Don't you think you should have asked Mom and Dad first? Jessica directed the question at Jake. I guess. Mr. Braun, in my body, answered with a believable shrug. Jessica turned back to me. I'm not trying to be rude, Mr. Braun, I said. Mr. Braun, I'm not trying to be rude, Jessica said. But our parents aren't here and Jake knows he's supposed to ask for permission before he does something like this. I won't be any bother, I said. And I plan to leave first thing in the morning. By then the roads will be plowed. I'll walk back to school, dig out my car, and go home. Jessica didn't look happy. She glanced at Jake. Where's he going to sleep? Jake's eyes darted toward me. The guest room in the basement, I said. How'd you know about that? Jessica scowled. Jake told me about it on the way here. Well, I guess it's all right. Jessica still didn't look happy. Just don't leave me a big mess in the kitchen, okay, Jake? Jessica was always bugging me about leaving the kitchen neat. Come with me, Lance. She clapped her hands. Lance got up and followed her back upstairs. I was glad because I was starving. I guess it took a lot of food to feed a body like Mr. Braun's. That half-finished lasagna was starting to look mighty tempting. You want any of this? I gestured to the lasagna as Mr. Braun, in my body, came into the kitchen. Okay, he nodded my head. I'd kind of been hoping he'd say no so I could eat the whole thing myself. But being a courteous host, I chopped it in half with a knife, slid my half on a plate, and ate it in 3 bites. Then I started rooting around the kitchen for more to eat. I made a triple-decker peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and followed it up with a box of strawberry Pop-Tarts, a bowl of Frosted Flakes, and a bag of chips. I washed it all down with a liter of Coke. Meanwhile, Mr. Braun went through the refrigerator and took out stuff for a salad. For dinner he had the remaining lasagna, salad, bread without butter, and a bowl of canned pineapple for dessert. Mr. Braun was real quiet while we ate. He looked almost like he was thinking. Want some chips? I asked, holding the bag out toward him. He shook his head. You eat like this all the time. Sure, I said. Only usually I don't eat as much. Do you have any idea how much cholesterol, saturated fat, sodium, sugar, and preservatives you've just consumed? He asked. I shrugged. Didn't really think about it. You have to stop eating this way, he said. I don't have to do anything. I grabbed another handful of chips and stuffed them into Mr. Braun's mouth. He sighed wearily. Listen, maybe you don't care what you do to your own body, but you could be a little more considerate about how you treat mine. Looks who's talking, I said. You're the one that went around smashing my body into those tables in the gym. It's who, Mr. Braun said. What's who? I asked. You're the one who went around smashing into tables, he said. Not that went around. I stared at him in disbelief. You're correcting my English. You're just a kid. No, I'm a physical education teacher stuck in a kid's body, he replied. Whatever, I grumbled. Either way, don't tell me what to eat and don't tell me how to talk, okay? Mr. Braun narrowed my eyes at me. You know, Sherman, Mr. Braun, to you, dimwad. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly, as if he were seething or something. You know, someday we're going to switch back. And when we do, you're going to be one very sorry little punk. I rolled my eyes. Like I was really supposed to be scared. Dream on, wuss. School was canceled the next day. In the morning, Alex called about shoveling snow, but Mr. Braun begged off. We walked over to his place instead. I don't think he wanted to show me where he lived, but I told him I couldn't stay at my house anymore. It would be too weird for Mr. Braun to sleep there 2 nights in a row. And besides, I said, my parents will be coming home later. They're gonna think it's really bizarre that my gym teacher is staying over 2 nights in a row. Mr. Braun, in my body, smiled like he thought he had the upper hand. Hey, that's not my problem. Oh, yeah, I said. Well, if you don't let me stay at your place I'll have to sleep in the church basement with the homeless people. And I'll probably wind up getting head lice. AV formed in Mr. Braun's, my forehead. Okay, I'll take you there. But so help me, if you wreck anything I'll save it, wuss, I growled. Mr. Braun lived on the second floor of a two-story garden apartment complex. On the way there he lectured me about how I better take good care of his place and be nice to his neighbors and stuff like that. Finally we got there. Mr. Braun lived in a own-bedroom apartment. You never saw any place so neat and clean. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Muscle magazines with covers of unnaturally muscular men and women were piled neatly on the coffee table. The kitchen was clean and shiny. About 20 large bottles of pills were lined up on the counter. Mr. Braun went over all of them for me. These are your amino acids, he said. Here's your lactose-free whey protein. This is your beta-carotene, vitamin B12, E, C, and bioflavonoids. Here you've got your iron, zinc, potassium, magnesium, calcium, and boron. And here, he suddenly stopped. A semi-goofy look came over my face. Kind of sounds like I eat the natural resources of Montana every morning, doesn't it? I wasn't sure if he was kidding or not. Does all this stuff really come from Montana? Mr. Braun scowled at me. Forget it, Sherman. The point is, as long as you're in my body, this is what you have to take every day. And this is what you are going to eat. He opened his refrigerator, which was filled with vegetables, fruits, whole grain breads, and junk like that. Then he gave me this big lecture on how, if I was going to use his body, I had an obligation to eat all this stuff instead of the garbage I normally ate. Okay, fine, it's a deal, I said, hoping to get him to leave so I could go out and get some chips and stuff. But Mr. Braun wasn't finished. Now we'll go over to the burn center, he said. Why, Mr. Braun pointed at me, because this body takes work.
On the way over, Mr. Braun explained how he worked out every day after school. It turned out that it was the same place Jessica went to, which was probably why he looked familiar to her. You're allowed to bring a guest once for free, so I went in as him and he went in as my guest, Jake Sherman. The burn center is one of those high-tech gyms with all these machines that look like padded torture racks. The walls are lined with floor-to-ceiling mirrors, and you can watch the TVs that hang from the ceiling or listen to rock music piped through speakers. Walking in was kind of cool, because all these muscle guys and girls knew Mr. Braun and were really friendly. I sort of got the feeling Mr. Braun was respected as one of the more serious and dedicated muscleheads around. We went into the free weight room where people mostly use barbells and dumbbells. Without being too obvious about it, Mr. Braun, in my body, showed me, in his body, how to do all the exercises. It was pretty cool to pick up those huge bars loaded with weights, and grunt and groan as I lifted them. I felt like a real musclehead, which, for the moment at least, was exactly what I was. Go for the burn, Mr. Braun urged in a low voice as I bench pressed whoa pound SL, the what? I grunted, feeling like the veins in Mr. Braun's body were going to burst. The burn, he said. When your muscles build up lactic acid and feel like they're burning. The whole idea is to max out into muscle failure. Talk English, I groaned. Speak English, he corrected me again. Whatever. 2 bench presses was all I could do. Mr. Braun patted me on his shoulder. Good work. Rest. I sat up and caught my breath. Mr. Braun's heart was pounding. His muscles were pumped up like the guys on the covers of the muscle magazines. My veins were popping out and my skin was glistening with sweat. The whole effect was totally cool. For one brief shining moment, I felt like Arnold. Meanwhile, Mr. Braun, in my body, stood in front of a mirror. He rolled up his sleeve and tried to make a muscle. It was really pitiful. There was hardly a bump where the muscle was supposed to be. He slid his sleeve down and looked totally dejected. We stayed at the burn center for nearly 3 hours. Almost every time I lifted a weight, a couple of people would stop and watch. Like I was a star or something. It was pretty obvious what being a big muscle guy was all about. It was a giant head trip. When we finally finished, I really hated to leave. Getting all that attention was a real goof. As Mr. Braun and I left, everyone said goodbye. I felt popular. Meanwhile, Mr. Braun, in my body, stood off to the side with his lips pursed together tightly. Ready? He finally asked, as if he were annoyed at me pretending to be him. We were going out the door when Amber strolled up wearing a coat and sweatpants. She looked surprised to see me and Mr. Braun together. Hi, Mr. Braun, hi, Jake, she said. I've never seen you here before. Mr. Braun, in my body, didn't say anything because he thought she was talking to me. Actually, she was talking to me, but since he was in my body, she was talking to him. Amber frowned while she waited for Jake to answer. Hey, Sherman, I said. She's talking to you. Huh. Oh, yeah, Mr. Braun, in my body. Seemed distracted. Mr. Braun brought me here today. I'm going to start working out. Amber smiled. That's great. So maybe he'll see you here, sometime, I said to Amber. That would be neat, Amber said. Since Amber was going in, and we were leaving, we said goodbye. We started to walk along the sidewalk. It was a sunny day. The ground, buildings and cars were covered with a foot of fresh white snow. As we walked, Mr. Braun, in my body, hardly said a thing. Once again, it seemed as if he was thinking. I was thinking too. This was totally unlike the time I switched bodies with Mr. Dirksen, or got stuck in the first day of school. When those things happened, I couldn't wait to get back to normal. But this was different. This time I really liked it. The next week was a blast. The science fair ended and they moved the tables out of the gym. FD planned to let the kids goof off during gym, but from the moment I took over my first class, I made those kids work their tails off. Maybe it was a power trip or just my way of getting back at Mr. Braun now that he was in my body. Every period they ran relays and went sprints, climbed ropes, and did push-ups, pull-ups, and sit-ups until they were sprawled on the floor, exhausted. Meanwhile, I put a TV in the gym office so FD have something to watch in my spare time. The only real problem was food. Mr. Braun's body was always hungry. I finally solved that by going to the food warehouse and getting a bunch of those huge bags of chips, pretzels, and other junk. Rap. I was in the gym office, watching a talk show, when someone knocked on the door. It was just before the last period of the day. In a few moments, my old gym class would be coming in. They were my favorites. Come in, I said without taking my eyes off the TV. Josh pushed open the door. One of the highlights of the week had been making him hustle until his face turned bright red and he collapsed each day on the wrestling mats in total exhaustion. What's up, Hopka? My feet were up on the desk and I was munching on a bag of bright orange corn twirls. I have a note. Josh slid a white envelope across the desk. I tore it open and read, Dear Mr. Braun. Please excuse Josh from gym class today. Last night he clipped his toenails too short and his toes are sore. I gave Josh a scornful look. Get off it. It's true, Mr. Braun, he said. They're really sore. I pointed at the locker room. Get in there and get changed before you give me 20. But I've got a note. Josh pleaded. I don't care if you have the United States Constitution. I growled. You're taking class. Josh screwed up his face angrily, but instead of saying anything, he looked around the office. His eyes stopped at the TV. You never had a TV in here before. Well, aren't you observant? I grumbled. Now make like a rainforest and disappear. Josh was hardly out the door when Amber Sweeney came in with a note asking that she be excused from class. Her mom didn't want Amber to get her hair messed up that day. What's that all about? I asked. Amber blushed a little. Well, there's this photographer in town who says he wants to try me in a newspaper ad for Burger's department store. He's going to take some pictures of me after school today and my mom's worried that if I get all sweaty in gym I won't look good. I see, I said. I mean, just between you and me, Mr. Braun, I think she's being pretty silly. I'm sure I could fix up my hair at the photographer's studio. It wouldn't be a big deal. No, it's important that you look your best, I said. You're excused. The next person was Andy, who limped in on crutches with a note saying that he'd slipped on an icy step the night before and twisted his ankle. That's too bad, I said. Yeah, it really hurts, he said. Get changed into your gym clothes, I said. Andy stared at me like I was out of my mind. Got a problem, Kent? I asked. I can't take gym, he said. I'm on crutches. You're excused from running, but you can still do sit-ups and push-ups. I turned back to the talk show. Andy's jaw dropped. He just stood there. Catching flies, Kent? I asked without looking away from the TV. Andy shook his head and limped toward the door. But just before he went out, he stopped. Know what, Mr. Braun? What? You've gotten really mean. Then he went out. I stared at the TV, but I was thinking about what he'd said. Maybe I had gotten mean. The funny thing was, it felt good.